Bill Thompson for Outside Insiders this Sunday morning. Bill Shorten has been in the studio for his interview with Barry Cassidy, which was interrupted by an incident apparently involving a cameraman who felt unwell. I'm just waiting for Bill Shorten to emerge from the underground car park. I had hoped to ask him about a briefing that I provided to Bill when he was Assistant Treasurer and Minister for Superannuation back in 2012. There was a huge financial scandal known as Trio Capital, which occurred when offshore scammers took over an existing financial services company in Australia and used it to fleece superannuation investors and others of $175 million, which was dispatched over a few years to offshore tax havens, never to be recovered. There was a parliamentary inquiry into the failure of Trio Capital. I made a submission similar to this one to that parliamentary inquiry, but they chose not to address my submission or include it in their final report, which came out I think in May of 2012. But included in the report were references to a number of individuals who had suffered substantial losses in relation to the Trio Capital matter, and I was able to identify some of the people who were named in the report, and I contacted them and asked if they were aware of certain information which I had gleaned from public internet searches in the years 2011, early 2012, and as a result of my contacting them, they asked me if I would be prepared to come to a meeting that they had organised with Bill Shorten and Greg Medcraft, the head of ASIC at the time, and a guy named Ross Jones, I believe, who was a senior person in APRA, the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority. And this meeting took place on the 5th of July 2012, and I paid to fly up to Sydney from Melbourne to attend that meeting and then fly back later in the day. And I was delivering my submission. I'll just hold off, there's some traffic here. Now, a vehicle that's coming out is a white people mover with Z number plates. I'm not going to show the number. I believe this is Mr. Shorten emerging from the ABC studios. Yes, to pick up my train of thought, I attended the meeting in Sydney on the 5th of July 2012 and sat across the desk from Bill Shorten, the Assistant Treasurer and Minister for Superannuation, and Greg Medcraft from ASIC and Ross Jones from APRA, and I attempted to deliver a lengthy briefing. I at some point got the bum's rush to wind it up, and so I handed a hard copy of the briefing paper, similar to this. I handed it across the table to Mr. Shorten and took my leave. The submission included references to the former Commissioner of Taxation, Michael Carmody, spruiking AUSTRAC on an ABC TV current affairs program in 2004, and saying what an important tool AUSTRAC reports were in keeping track of cash transactions and overseas fund transfers, to be able to identify and crack down on tax evasion. In my submission to Mr. Shorten and ASIC and APRA, I asked them whether AUSTRAC reports were available in relation to the approximately $175 million which had been stolen from Australian investors and sent to offshore tax havens. I asked them whether there had been any AUSTRAC reports about those transactions, and there are two relevant sorts of reports from AUSTRAC. There's international fund transfer instructions, and I used to see what we called IFTIs during my 26-year employment with the Australian Tax Office as an auditor. And there was also something called suspect transaction reports from AUSTRAC. And I won't go into detail about those, but I think the title will tell you generally what they're about. I asked Mr. Shorten and Mr. Jones and Mr. Medcraft in my submission whether there had been AUSTRAC reports, either IFTIs or SUSTers, in relation to any and all of the transfers of monies, $175 million that was stolen from the investors in Trio Capital and sent to offshore tax havens. And I never got a response from either Mr. Shorten or from Mr. Medcraft or Mr. Jones. I've written to numerous politicians and oversight agencies in the intervening years asking why I didn't get a response and whether any of my questions had been answered internally within government circles. Never got a response from any of that. Fast forward to a year or two ago, there was a hue and cry because the Commonwealth Bank apparently had failed to report millions of dollars of cash transactions that went through their smart ATMs. And that revelation and others, I believe, formed part of the basis for calls for a royal commission into the banking and superannuation industries. My question, based on the material that I found in my public internet searches, was what's the point of banks going to all the time and expense of assembling the international fund transfer information and suspect transaction reports and forwarding them to AUSTRAC if all of that hard work couldn't, in the end, prevent the offshore scammers from stealing $175 million in the Trio Capital fraud? Why are the banks going to all this trouble and expense if the government isn't using the bloody information? I'd hoped to be able to ask Mr. Shorten about his failure, apparent failure, to address the concerns I raised with him personally in 2012. But as you saw, I had seen him arrive earlier in the white People Mover vehicle, and I watched as the vehicle emerged from the ABC Underground car park. And that's another aspect of current life in Melbourne. The normal citizens of Melbourne have experienced over the last few years armed robberies in shops, home invasions, carjackings, assaults in the street from a variety of offenders. But on occasion I've seen the Premier of Victoria, Daniel